Tonight on Life on the Rock, we have Mary Eberstadt, Part 2, I'll Give a Reflection, and much more. Welcome to Life on the Rock. Tonight our guest is Mary Eberstadt. She's written a new book, Adam and Eve After the Pill, Revisited. And we continue our discussion with her about the impacts of the sexual revolution on society, on politics, on Christianity, and just how it has created a strong secularism in our country.
This is a part 2 of a 2-part show, and Mary brings a lot of great insight. She's well read, and she's done her research, so we encourage all of you to read this book. We're now going to a reflection with Father Mark.
I was talking to a young man the other day, and he was telling me that he wanted to become Catholic. He said that in his church, I started asking deeper questions, and they tell him, well, just believe in God and love, don't worry about it, But he kept having these questions come up in his heart, and eventually led him to the Catholic Church. And I was thinking of 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. That there's a maturing of the faith that needs to happen. There needs to be a development of that faith and education in the faith. This is an essential part of evangelization. We call it catechesis, this teaching of the faith, and lay it out in a more systematic way. Evangelization is fostering this encounter with Christ and basic themes of salvation and redemption, creation, sin, and grace and things. But we need to be taught the faith in a very real way. I'm here in Washington Square. This is the Italian district of San Francisco. Italian immigrants were coming in, and they had their children had a lot of needs. Some of them were falling into delinquency, and the Salesians came in and built a school and a boys' club and really established a community here. Joe DiMaggio played baseball in one of these parks around here. So there's this great Catholic heritage of teaching the faith, working with kids and developing that instruction. So it's so crucial, that education, because the faith needs to be nourished and deepened. And one receives that through the ministry of the church. This beautiful church, Saints Peter and Paul, is 100 years old. It's one of the maybe the most beautiful church in San Francisco. And there's a great heritage of faith around it. And new communities are moving in and coming to the church as well, Asian communities as well. So the church is there to evangelize and to catechize. Mary Eberstadt, welcome back to Life on the Rock.
Thank you, Father Mark.
And we're continuing our conversation about your book, Adam and Eve and the Pill, Revisited. And I thought this was interesting that you yourself grew up your parents were divorced and then your mom remarried. So you've experienced these things you write about in a very real way.
Yes, I have. And so I know that there's a great spectrum out there. That is to say, not all of these negative consequences have to happen to everybody involved. I had a wonderful stepfather. But I do think the fact that my parents were divorced connects me in a way to people who have the same sort of broken situation, and it does make it easier for me to talk about this. I think people who don't come out of that situation often feel as if they're being accused of moralizing or holier than thou, and that's not the case with me. So that's part of what enables the work that I do.
And you write about it, and I hadn't read this or recall reading this before, but you talk about this deep connection between family and religious practice, that is the real driver, not oftentimes, I think people say, myself included, that it seems like prosperity drives out religion oftentimes, but you make a different case, don't you?
Well, I do, because the idea that prosperity drives out religion has too many counterexamples. So, for example, in Victorian London, as is well documented, the most practicing Christians in town were those at the top of the socioeconomic ladder, and the further down you went, the less practicing they were. And there are other examples I could name. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons in America, exhibit a similar pattern. So this has happened too often to say it's just that we got kind of rich and happy and didn't need God anymore. I think what's going on in the decline of Western Christianity is, again, something much closer to home. Broken homes become a kind of conveyor belt of disbelief. I think we see this very clearly with the rise of the so-called nuns. Where are these kids coming from who are totally unchurched? I think part of the answer is that when mom and dad split up, first of all, there's a logistical problem there. How do you accomplish religious education if you're in the other parent's home every other Sunday, say? That's just common sense.
Right.
But also the splitting up of the family is a problem in itself when Christianity tells people that the family is holy and connected somehow to divinity. And people have a lot of cognitive dissonance trying to process that under the circumstances after the revolution. So I think, again, what we were seeing in the numbers of on church attendance have a lot to do with the way people have been living since the 1960s, and not as much to do with the factors that are, often cited instead.
Right, and I've seen that certainly. Like a young couple gets married and they become more church practicing, religious practicing people, and I think oftentimes what I hear is like they want to raise their kids and they want those values for their children. But you also make the point that the support they get from church, right? Because the family needs help, support, especially too, you might be disconnected because the society is so mobile and moving for work and stuff, to get disconnected from extended family, that church community becomes very important.
Yes, I have an anecdote about that. I have a young friend who, upon he and his wife having their third child, found themselves in difficult circumstances. As you can imagine, they didn't have family around. And he said, what kept me sane was the weekly drop-off of the Monday night dinner by people at church. So those little things go a long way, and that kind of grassroots support of family, where we're not talking about family in the abstract, but about instead a couple of hours of babysitting or a meal or whatever it might be, we should never underestimate how important that kind of support is.
Right. So you also write interesting too about how today we've progressed now to actually not just forgetting about God, as we did in the 20th century with the rise of atheism and different governmental forms, but now we're in a war with God culturally, right? I thought that was a great point.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to put it in those martial terms, because if we look at society today, the fight is all about who directs creation, who gets to control creation. Is it us or is it somebody else? The traditional answer from Christianity, of course, is God. But we have abortion at the beginning of life, say. We have contraception before that, and then we have abortion, and all the way up to the end of life, with an increased pressure for euthanasia across the Western world. What we are seeing are examples of that defiant rebel yell that says, no, I create myself. I control my circumstances. I control my life. I decide what form I take and it takes, and it's all up to me. Again, the question is whether living this way is actually good for people, and I think, as the book argues, that we are surrounded by evidence that it's not good for people to be atomized in this way and self-creating in the absence of strong ties with other human beings.
And as it's often been said, we're going to worship something, and so you see this strong embrace of secularism with its absolutist, obedience that's demanded in our culture that seems so intolerant, so unforgiving. The cancel culture, right? There's rules, there's codes to follow, is there not?
Yes, I'd like to seize on that word forgiving, because again, I think this is a very important fault line and a place where the church can really make headway. Because the great problem with secularism, and we see this every day, is that there is no forgiveness. There is no redemption. If you violate the laws in a particularly progressive community, say, whether they are speech codes or behavioral codes, you are cast out. There is no coming back to the fold. These communities, and I use that word advisedly, are far more unforgiving than any religious community I can think of. So our advantage here is that human beings need redemption. Everybody's fallen, everybody sins. Christianity has an app for that. It's called confession, and the secularist alternatives have none. It's a much more bitter, crabbed, nasty place than the place offered by the church to fallen human beings, and we should press that advantage.
Right. It seems like, people want to get at maybe a person's political leanings, and then they're completely put into a box, right? And there's like no kind of middle ground ability to work together. And that's really frightening to me, like politically, what we see in our country today.
We see it in politics. We also see it in the particular example of abortion, where now activists insist on abortion up until the moment of birth. That is a grisly insistence. Why can there be no compromise about that issue? And I think the answer is, as we saw in the fury over the Dobbs decision, those activists understand that they're standing on shaky ground, that there is something wrong with their position, as the Dobbs case made very clear. And what they fear is that rollback in one area, say abortion, is going to lead to a rethinking of other aspects of the sexual revolution. And I think this is exactly what's beginning to happen. So it's a very exciting moment to be trying to put forward a contrarian view of these things.
We have to take a short break. We'll be back to continue our conversation with Mary Eberstadt. Mary, you write about how the secular side depends on self-censorship. What do you mean by self-censorship?
I think we all know what we mean by that. There's quite a lot of pressure on religious believers of all kinds to just suck it up, stop talking about these things, sit down at the table with all of the people who are dominating the conversation and let them do that. There's a lot of pressure out there. We see it on university campuses, we see it in the workplace increasingly, but we are also starting to see some pushback, and that's a good thing.
Right. I know sometimes you hear that phrase, I've never heard a homily on such and such, and it kind of reminds me of the importance to talk about these issues, to have them in our preaching that's so formative for people. But with all these things against us, you still are a person of hope. I was struck by the hope that you do have, that we can turn this around. Talk about that hope you have for our culture.
Yeah, well, I'm hopeful for more than one reason. So the first is that 10 years ago, when I published the first Adam and Eve book, it didn't make a ripple in the secular world. It was widely attended in religious circles, which was gratifying, but it was published at a time when it was still considered outrageous to make a case against the sexual revolution. By contrast, during the last couple of years alone, there have been several books, as it happens, all of them written by women, in England, in Germany, in the United States, books by perfectly secular or secularish women saying, wait a minute, there's something really wrong with romance today. Are we having problems because of things like pornography? Hey, maybe we need to take a second look at what's been happening since the 1960s. And these books have gone on to generate other conversations. So that is to say that the issues that I've been raising in the Adam and Eve books are now being more widely attended. So that's one reason for hope. Another reason for hope is that to take another subject, pornography, this too used to be something that outside religious orbits was not discussed. There was a libertarian consensus that seemed invincible about that subject, that this was all a harmless pursuit. But now there is a growing list of celebrities, as I mentioned in the book, who are coming out against this, saying this has been a problem in my life, this has been a problem in my marriage. And not only celebrities, but also secular men, especially young men, who are starting to resist this stuff, understanding that it's toxic. So those are two reasons to be hopeful. But the biggest one, I think, is that I see in all of these dark issues vindication for the teachings of the Catholic Church. I think that vindication is there, and it's ironic that just as all of this evidence piles up that the Church is right about the sanctity of the family, just as it piles up, we hear new voices within all the Christian churches saying, wait, let us join the cool kids here. Let us compromise with this sexual revolution thing. This is a great irony of our time, I believe.
I know. It was just staggering to me to hear some of the voices in the church today, calling for a rethinking of contraception and challenges to veritatis splendor. And I think we've been through all this before, right? When I entered religious life, this was records of history, that these battles were fought, people lost positions, and sacrifices were made. And then we're talking about it again now. I was like, it was just shocking.
It's amazing how short human memory must be, I guess. But there is an entire chapter in this new book that is aimed exactly at what you're describing. That is, those people within the church who have not learned the lessons of history. Because this attempt to draw a smiley face on Christianity is not new. This has been done many times before. It's always done about the same issues, which are the teachings about marriage and sex. And look what has happened to the churches that decided to throw out those teachings and just make nice. Those churches of the Protestant main line are imploding. They will not exist in a matter of decades. So it's baffling to me how anybody looking at the religious record alone doesn't see the lesson of history here.
And I guess we have to remember the world, the flesh, and the devil is against us. And those are real enemies that are constantly trying to tear at the church. And, it hit me recently, too, when some of these powerful voices speak this secularism. I got to the point where I heard for the church that you're tearing at the bride of Christ. And that calls for tears, doesn't it, at times? It calls for a fight, but it hit me in a new way recently.
I understand that, and I would add to it that the church, the voices within the church that are trying to change the church are also not understanding the needs of the converts coming into the church because of all the wreckage out there. There are people who never knew anything about church teaching, but who somehow, through a chance conversation, are drawn to cross a doorstep in a church, only to find that that's what they've been looking for. They've been looking for these things that the secular world cannot provide them, and in principle would deny them. Those people need a home, and they need to be able to enter it without being told, wait a minute, we were just kidding about all that. Now we're going to change it up, and you won't have what you need here.
And you write beautifully about, the Lambeth Conference, 1930, Anglicanism allowed, contraception, and how, it's presented as just certain isolated particular cases due to these circumstances. And then over time, it grows into promotion. It leads into homosexuality, acceptance of abortion. It's just staggering, really, how that happens.
And it's the same cycle we see repeated in all the churches of the main line. It may have started within the Anglican Communion, but it seemed to be a kind of inevitable unwinding once that line is crossed about contraception. And again, to the point of religious history, by contrast, where the Anglican Communion remains strong these days is in sub-Saharan Africa, where people are much more traditional-minded and where Catholics and Protestants alike reject contraception in great numbers.
All right, and we just have 30 seconds. For me, like a great hope is that it's written in our hearts, these desires for marriage, family, love, permanence, and it's just in us. We desire that. The Catholic Church is teaching that. So if we could just kind of uncover that in people and say, yes, we want to help you live that, I think that's such a hope for us.
Catholics should be proud in the right way of all these unpopular teachings. They're only unpopular for the moment, and as you say, they resonate with the human heart, and that, again, is our advantage as we try to press this case.
Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining us, for your work. It gives me material in my preaching. You make it also accessible. You make a strong case, logical, appealing to reason, natural law. It's just a great contribution you've made, so thank you.
Thank you for having me, Father Mark.
I enjoyed our conversation with Mary and a point she makes, starting with the Solzhenitsyn quote of that the 20th century man forgot about God, and now man has waged war against God. That's our form of secularism now. It's just really aggressive approach.
And there's definitely a hostility there that you can kind of sense in the culture and society. But again, secularism, as she says, it offers no forgiveness. There's no sense of redemption. You just kind of become a unit in a machine. And once your part's over, you're done kind of thing. And there's not a great sense of happiness or joy or relief. And you can kind of look at the world and say, are people truly happier? No, I don't think so. I think we see more problems in today that, other problems have always existed, but, we see it in the young. A lot of things are just kind of ruined because, again, we don't have families that are staying together. There isn't that love and support, that discipline, that kind of builds society, that kind of make everything very fruitful. But we've kind of seen the opposite. There's just a lot of wounded people, right, especially.
Its basic thesis is that contraception, which separates the procreative meaning from the unitive meaning of it, leads to all these problems, right? It distorts what marriage is and this openness to life, and it leads to what we've seen in the church today, the promotion of promiscuity in some churches, and abortion, and even gay marriage, and recognizing homosexuality as a valid lifestyle.
And I think there's just a lie that says, it's all harmless, or it's promoted as a good. Mm-hmm. But again, when you look at these problems, the statistics, it's like they've quadrupled in some cases. And it's kind of a staggering thing. And I think part of it, goes to the fact that when you allow for contraception and all that, people are going to take more risks, because there's kind of this, they believe in a safety net that doesn't exist. And I think just to expose those lies, that some of these structures are there for purpose, to keep us healthy and in order for growth. But again, we're kind of cutting out our roots on many things. So,
and the book is about a well-reasoned argument for the church's teaching. So she's not making a strong theological case, but of course there is one. This is what our church teaches, and we don't need to go down the path of other churches. So on this show, I like to speak to the Catholics in the pew, to awaken them to have some zeal on these issues, because we have the truth. We have a duty as missionaries. We all share in the missionary nature of the church to go out and proclaim this truth. And as she makes the point, not to self-censor ourselves, that not to, we have to be compassionate and loving and kind, but to speak the truth. Not to fall prey to the lies and some of the changes in vocabulary and stuff they always want to foist upon us, but to boldly proclaim the gospel.
And I think there are great resources in this area, and I think this book is one of them. If we don't know anything or don't know enough on the issue, just start reading this book. Really, I think enlightening a lot of people. So.
Well, may our Heavenly Father shine His face upon you and give you His peace. May He pour forth His Holy Spirit upon you to send you on mission into this culture to proclaim the gospel of the family boldly and without hesitation. May God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We'll see you next week on Life on the Rock.